The gun was already drawn when she walked through the door. Bridget Farrow stood in the threshold of the Caldwell Creek Sheriff's Office, her traveling trunk scraping against the wooden floorboards, her breath still ragged from the stagecoach ride that had rattled every bone in her body for 11 straight hours. Dust clung to the hem of her dress like a second skin. Her knuckles were white around the handle of her carpet bag. And the man behind the desk, the man she had been hired to work for, the man whose correspondence had been nothing but clipped, impersonal, borderline rude for the past 3 months, had a revolver pointed directly at the door, not at her. She understood that a half-second later, when the click of the hammer release echoed through the small room and the barrel swung sideways, away from her entirely, toward the shadow that had been lurking just outside the back window. A shadow that disappeared the moment the gun appeared. "Close the door," he said. His voice was not what she had expected either. It was low and measured, the kind of voice that had been trained to stay level even when the world was on fire. Noah Ellery, sheriff of Caldwell Creek, did not look up from the window he was watching. He kept his back half-turned to her, his broad shoulders rigid beneath a worn canvas duster, his badge catching the last bleed of afternoon light coming through the dirty glass. Bridget closed the door. She did not drop her bag. She did not move. Every letter he had written her had been exactly 4 lines long. Position available. Housekeeper and administrative assistant to the sheriff's department. Room and board provided. Reply only if serious. There had been no warmth in any of it. No pleasantries. No indication that this man possessed anything resembling a human interior. She had prepared herself for cold. She had rehearsed the professional distance she would maintain, the careful boundaries she would draw. She had told herself she was simply taking a job, nothing more, a temporary post until she had saved enough to start over somewhere else entirely. She was 26 years old, newly arrived in the Arizona Territory from Philadelphia, and carrying a secret that she had no intention of sharing with anyone, least of all a man who wrote 4-line letters. She had not prepared for the smell of food. It was the strangest thing, the stranger thing, stranger even than the gun, stranger than the shadow outside the window, stranger than the taut silence that still hummed through the room like a plucked wire. The smell of warm bread, and something slow-cooked, and savory wound through the small office the way smoke winds through an open field. It came from the back room, the room she could see through a half-open door, where a small iron stove sat against a stone wall and a table had been set with 2 plates. 2 plates. Not one. She had arrived expecting a cold employer. The sheriff had a warm meal already waiting. Noah Ellery finally turned around, and Bridget Farrow looked at the man who had written her those terrible, impersonal letters, and felt the first crack appear in every single wall she had ever built. 3 months earlier, Bridget had been standing in the offices of the Philadelphia Register, trying to keep her voice from shaking while she resigned a position she had held for 4 years. She had been the best administrative secretary that newspaper had ever employed, and everyone in that building knew it. And none of that had mattered even slightly when her supervisor, a man named Gerald Purcell, who wore his wedding ring on the wrong hand out of spite, had made it clear that certain accusations would follow her wherever she tried to work in the city if she did not make certain accommodations to his preferences. She had resigned before he could finish the sentence. She had taken a room at her cousin Margaret's house for 2 weeks while she figured out what to do next. And it was Margaret who had spread the Philadelphia Inquirer across the breakfast table one morning and tapped a small notice in the employment section with one finger. Government positions in the Western Territories. various municipalities seeking administrative support for growing townships. Applications considered from qualified women. The notice had been placed by something called the Territorial Employment Bureau, which turned out to be a single harried man named Mr. Davies operating out of a converted broom closet in a federal building. He had reviewed Bridget's qualifications with wide eyes. She had shorthand, she had bookkeeping, she had 4 years of managing a newsroom, and told her there were several positions available, but that the one in Caldwell Creek, Arizona, paid the best and included housing. The correspondence with Sheriff Noah Ellery had begun the following week. His first letter had read, "Position is administrative assistant and general housekeeper. Hours are 6 in the morning to 6 in the evening, 6 days a week. Pay is $12 per month plus room and board. Applicants must be capable of managing records, correspondence, and basic domestic duties." Sheriff N. Ellery. She had written back a careful, professional reply listing her qualifications and asking several reasonable questions about the nature of the work and the living arrangements. He had replied, "Questions noted. Arrangements are separate quarters above the office. Duties as described. Reply if accepting." N. Ellery. She had shown Margaret the correspondence. Margaret had said, "He sounds like he might actually be a fence post in a coat." Bridget had accepted the position anyway, because she had exactly $11 to her name, because Philadelphia felt like a city that had been poisoned for her, and because something about the bluntness of those letters had felt, in a peculiar way, honest. Gerald Purcell had been all warm words and hidden motives. Noah Ellery had no hidden motives because he apparently had no motivation to communicate at all. The stagecoach ride from Tucson to Caldwell Creek had taken the better part of a day and had deposited her in front of a building that looked more like a tired sigh than a structure, its painted letters reading Sheriff. Caldwell Creek, barely visible through the accumulated grime of the season. She had knocked. No one had answered. She had waited 10 minutes, then tried the door, which was unlocked, and walked into the moment that she had already described to herself twice in her head and was still not quite finished processing. Noah Ellery was 32 years old, though she would not learn that until later. He was tall in the way that men in this part of the country seemed to be, like the land itself had stretched them, and he had dark hair that needed cutting and a jaw that looked like it had been shaped by someone with strong opinions about right angles. His eyes, when he finally turned them on her, were a shade of dark gray that she had no good word for yet, the color of the sky over the ocean about 20 minutes before a serious storm decided to commit. He looked at her for a long moment. He looked at her trunk. He looked at her carpet bag. He looked at her face, which she was fairly certain had accumulated enough trail dust to qualify as a geological feature. "You must be Miss Farrow," he said. "I must be," she agreed. He holstered the revolver with the ease of a man for whom this motion required about as much conscious thought as breathing, and he came around the desk and picked up her trunk as though it weighed nothing, which it emphatically did not, and he said, "Dinner's ready. We can talk after." She followed him through the half-open door, past the iron stove, to the table set with 2 plates, and she sat down across from a man she had never met, in a territory she had barely arrived in, and ate the best beef stew she had tasted in years while the evening light turned amber against the stone walls and the whole impossible situation settled around her shoulders like something that almost felt like belonging. Caldwell Creek was a town of roughly 400 people in the year 1882, situated in the southeastern corner of the Arizona Territory, about 30 miles from the Mexican border. The railroad had not reached it yet, though the talk was that it was coming. There was always talk about the railroad coming, and the economy ran on cattle ranching, a modest silver mine that was starting to show real production numbers, and the kind of general commerce that springs up wherever people have gathered and need to eat and drink and argue. The town had a main street that ran about 6 blocks, long enough to contain a general store, a hardware supplier, a barber shop, a doctor's office, a church that served 2 denominations on alternating Sundays, a hotel that functioned primarily as a saloon with occasional lodging, and any number of smaller establishments that came and went with the fortunes of their owners. On the southeastern edge of town, near the well, stood the sheriff's office and jail, a 2-story building that was solidly constructed and better maintained than it looked from the street. Bridget discovered this last fact on her first morning, when Noah gave her what he called the account of the place in the same tone a man might use to read a bill of inventory. The ground floor was the office, with a desk, 2 cabinets full of records that he described as a catastrophe I have not had time to address, a locked evidence room, and 2 jail cells currently occupied by a man named Dodd who had broken a window at the saloon and been sleeping it off for 24 hours. The upper floor had 2 rooms, his on the east side and the one she would occupy on the west, with its own door accessible from the external staircase on the side of the building. "I will not enter your room without your permission," he said, as if reading from a policy document he had written specifically for this occasion. "I expect the same courtesy." "Agreed," she said. "The kitchen is shared," he continued. "I cook Monday, Wednesday, Friday. You cook Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday. Sunday we fend for ourselves or go to the hotel dining room." She blinked. "You cook." He looked at her with those storm-colored eyes and said nothing for a moment, as if he were trying to determine whether the question was meant as an insult or a genuine inquiry. "Yes," he said finally. "I learned. It was that or starve." She almost smiled. She did not quite, because she was still calibrating this person, still trying to find the architecture of who he was under the flat effect of his communication style. But the corner of her mouth moved, and he noticed it, and something in his expression shifted by approximately 1 degree, which she suspected was significant. She spent her first full day in Caldwell Creek organizing the records cabinet, which was, in fact, a catastrophe. 4 years of filings had been deposited in something resembling the aftermath of a minor explosion. Incident reports, correspondence with the territorial governor's office, property records, court summons, wanted posters that dated back to the previous sheriff, a collection of receipts for equipment purchases, and a hand-drawn map of the county with annotations she could barely read. She created a system in 6 hours that would have taken the average person a week, and she was on her 3rd cup of terrible coffee when Noah came back from his afternoon circuit of the town and stood in the doorway of the office looking at the reorganized space. He was quiet for a long time. "It's a temporary system," she said, thinking he might object. "I can change it if you have a preference." "No," he said. "It's better." He paused. "It's a lot better." There was something in the way he said it. Not effusive, not overly warm, but genuine. The kind of genuine that people produce when they have stopped bothering with pleasantries and are simply reporting truth. That hit her somewhere she had not expected. She went back to the filing and told herself it meant nothing. The shadow outside the window on her first evening turned out to be a man named Crane Holt, which she learned 2 days later when Noah sat down across from her at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, and a face arranged in the particular configuration she was beginning to recognize as him preparing to say something he had been considering for a while. "There's a situation you should know about," he said, "since you're here now and it affects the office." She put down her own coffee. "All right. There's a man named Crane Holt. He works for the Alderton Cattle Company, which is the largest operation in this county. The Alderton family has been in this territory since before it was a territory, and they have more money and more influence than any single entity in this part of Arizona. And for the past 8 months, cattle have been going missing from the smaller ranches, and 2 smaller ranchers have had accidents that weren't quite accidents, and every line of inquiry I have followed leads back to land that Alderton wants to acquire. She watched him. And Crane Holt. Holt is Alderton's man, his enforcer. He is not a subtle person. He was outside my window the night you arrived because he has made it his business to know what I'm doing at all times, which means he wanted to see who had arrived on the stage coach. Why? She asked, though she was starting to understand. Because I've been putting together a case for the territorial prosecutor, and anyone I'm talking to, anyone who might be a witness or a source or simply a person I trust, Holt considers a potential problem. He looked at her steadily. I'm telling you this because I don't want you to be surprised if he approaches you, and because you deserve to know the landscape you've walked into. Bridget felt something clarify in her chest. Not fear, but a sharp sort of attention, the same feeling she'd had the first time she had walked into the newsroom in Philadelphia, and understood that real information moved through a room in the spaces between the spoken words. What does Alderton want with the smaller ranches? There's a water source, Noah said. A creek that runs through 4 properties on the eastern side of the county. If Alderton controls those properties, he controls the water access for the entire region. In a territory where water is life, that's not just wealth, that's dominion. And the territorial prosecutor can stop him, with enough documented evidence, yes. He turned his coffee cup slowly in his hands. That's what I've been building toward. That's what the records you organized today are part of. She thought about this. She thought about Gerald Purcell and hidden motives and men who used their positions like weapons. She thought about the way Noah had told her all of this without dressing it up, without performing a heroism he had not earned yet, without asking anything of her. Then I'll help, she said. He looked at her with those gray eyes. You don't have to, I know, she said. That's why I'm offering. There was another one of those fractional shifts in his expression, that single degree of change that she was becoming more fluent in reading, and he said, all right. And they went back to their coffee, and the evening settled around them with a warmth that had nothing to do with the stove. Her room above the office was small but adequate. The bed was a proper iron frame bed with a decent mattress, which surprised her pleasantly. There was a washstand with a china basin, a wardrobe with 2 drawers, a window that looked west toward the flat expanse of desert and mountain that she was still learning to see as beautiful rather than simply vast. Noah had apparently spent some time preparing it. There were fresh linens, a new candle on the washstand, a small rag rug on the floor. These were not the gestures of a fence post in a coat. She thought about that on her 3rd night, lying in the iron bed listening to the town settle into its nighttime sounds. The distant music from the saloon, the dogs, the wind off the desert that had a particular quality to it, dry and warm and carrying traces of things she could not name. She thought about the warm meal that had been waiting for her, and the clean linens, and the way he had told her about Crane Holt without dressing it up. And she caught herself, and told herself firmly that she was here for a job, that she was in no condition to develop any feelings about any employer in any territory, and that she had a secret she was carrying that complicated everything, and she would do well to remember that. The secret was this: Bridget Farrow was not simply fleeing a bad job. She was also fleeing a formal accusation that Gerald Purcell had lodged against her with the Philadelphia police, a fabricated claim of theft of confidential documents, which was his revenge for her resignation, and for the fact that she had, in fact, taken copies of certain documents before she left, documents that recorded his pattern of behavior toward female employees, which she had then sent to 3 separate journalists. Purcell had the connections to make the official accusation seem credible. She had the evidence to make it crumble, but evidence required time and distance, and Philadelphia had neither. She had not lied in her application, but she had not told the whole truth. And lying here in this small room above a sheriff's office, she was acutely aware of the particular irony of her situation. The weeks passed in a rhythm that she found herself settling into with a naturalness that surprised her. Mornings, she was at the office desk by 6, managing the correspondence that came in by mail, drafting responses, filing reports, maintaining the evidence log that Noah kept in the locked room. He was almost always back before 7 after his early circuit of the town, and they would have coffee together at the kitchen table in what had quietly evolved from a purely functional arrangement into something she looked forward to each day. A 20-minute window when the office was still quiet and the world had not yet made its demands, and they talked. They talked about everything and nothing. Noah talked about these people with a careful attention that she recognized as genuine care, the kind of care that did not announce itself but ran very deep. She talked about Philadelphia, carefully, at first, selecting the parts that were safe. She talked about the newsroom, about the particular satisfaction of managing complex information, about Margaret and the breakfast table and the newspaper advertisement. She did not yet talk about Gerald Purcell, or the accusations, or the documents she had sent to 3 journalists, one of whom had written her a single letter 3 weeks after she arrived in Caldwell Creek, forwarded through Margaret, saying that the story was going to print. She tucked that letter in the bottom of her trunk and tried not to count days. On a Thursday evening, 6 weeks after her arrival, she was finishing the last of the filing when Crane Holt walked through the front door without knocking. He was a physical argument of a man, broad and compact, with a head that sat on his neck like a boulder on a shelf, and small eyes that moved quickly around a room the way an animal's eyes move, cataloging exits and threats. He wore 2 guns, which was relatively unusual, and he wore them like the people who wore them for the statement it made rather than the utility. He looked at Bridget across the office and smiled, which was less pleasant than his neutral expression. "You're the new girl," he said. She set down the document she was holding. "I am the sheriff's administrative assistant, yes," she said. "Is there something you need to report?" The smile stayed. "Just getting acquainted. Friendly county, this one. People like to know their neighbors." "Sheriff Ellery is out on his afternoon circuit," she said. "If you have official business, I can take a statement. If you don't, I'll ask you to come back when he's here." Something moved behind Holt's eyes, a small recalibration of his assessment of her. He had expected, she understood, someone who would be rattled by him. She was rattled, but she had spent 4 years in a newsroom where powerful men routinely walked in expecting deference, and had learned to perform a steadiness that felt, with practice, like the real thing. "Just friendly," he repeated. He looked around the office, letting his gaze rest on the reorganized cabinet, the evidence room door, the stack of correspondence on her desk. "Nice work you've done with the place." "Thank you," she said pleasantly. "Have a good evening, Mr. Holt." He left without another word. She waited until she heard his boots on the wooden sidewalk outside, then let out a long breath and sat down, and her hands were shaking, just slightly, which she decided she had earned. Noah came back 20 minutes later, and she told him what had happened with the precise detail of someone who had been trained to record information accurately under pressure. And he listened without interrupting, standing in the middle of the office with his hat in his hands, and when she finished he said, "You handled that exactly right." "He wanted me to be afraid," she said. "Were you?" She looked at him honestly. "Yes, but not so much that it mattered." He nodded once, slowly, and then he said, "Thank you for staying calm," and the way he said it, quietly, like something he meant very much, moved through her like warm water. They were falling toward each other, the way two people fall when neither of them is trying to, and both of them are trying very hard not to. The inevitable geometry of proximity and honesty, of shared meals and shared dangers, and the particular intimacy of two people living in the same building, hearing each other's footsteps overhead, knowing when the other one was awake and restless in the night. She learned that he had come to Caldwell Creek 4 years prior after leaving a position as a deputy in Tombstone, which she knew was a town that had seen the kind of violent notoriety that made newspapers in Philadelphia. He did not volunteer much about what had happened there, but from the careful, oblique way he occasionally referenced it, she understood that something had gone badly wrong, some situation involving a choice between loyalty and justice, and that the outcome had cost him things he had not fully recovered from. He learned that she was from a family of modest circumstances in Philadelphia, that her father had been a printer who had taught her to value language and precision, that she had educated herself well beyond what the formal schooling of her time and class had offered because she had been relentlessly curious from childhood, and books were, in the America of the late 19th century, the great democratic vehicle of self-improvement. He did not ask what had brought her all the way to the Arizona Territory. This was either discretion or instinct or both. She was not ready to tell him, and he seemed to understand that without being told, and the not telling sat between them like a held breath, something both of them knew was there and neither of them was yet prepared to address. It was the doctor, James Hooper, who inadvertently accelerated things. 7 weeks after Bridget's arrival, Hooper came to the office on a Wednesday morning with a face full of the kind of controlled urgency that she had learned was his version of alarm. He was not, she had gathered, a man given to visible alarm, which was probably a useful quality in a doctor. He sat down across from Noah's desk and he said, "I need to speak with you about Macy Prout." Macy Prout was the wife of one of the smaller ranchers, a man named Samuel Prout, who ran 120 head of cattle on a property that sat directly along the contested creek. 3 months before Bridget arrived, Prout had broken his leg in a fall from his horse. Or rather, a fall that had happened when his horse had been startled by a gunshot fired from somewhere in the hills that no one had been able to identify. The leg had healed, but Prout was still not entirely right, and Macy had come to Hooper complaining of anxiety and disrupted sleep, and a persistent sense that someone was watching the ranch at night. Hooper said, "She showed me something this morning. A letter, unsigned, left on their porch. It says, in effect, that it would be in the family's best interest to accept the offer that would be forthcoming from the Alderton Cattle Company for their property, and that failure to do so might result in further accidents." The room was very still. "She brought it to you?" Noah asked. "She trusts me," Hooper said simply. "She wanted to know if she should trust you." Noah looked at the doctor for a long moment. Then he said, "Tell her yes. Tell her to bring the letter to the office this afternoon. Tell her we'll protect her family." Hooper left. Noah sat at his desk for a moment, looking at nothing, and Bridget watched him from across the room. The set of his jaw, the way his hands were flat on the desk surface, the particular quality of his stillness, which was not the stillness of inaction but of a very powerful force that had found its direction. "This is what you've been waiting for," she said quietly. "Threatening letters," he said. "It's direct, it's documented. It's what the prosecutor needs to connect the harassment to Alderton's intent." He paused. "There will be more. Holt doesn't do half measures." If they're escalating to written threats, it means they're getting impatient, and impatient people make more evidence. Then we need to be ready to document everything as it comes." He looked at her. "We," he said, not as a correction, but as if the word had surprised him pleasantly. "Unless you'd prefer I stay out of it," she said. "No," he said. "I would prefer you stay exactly in it." The afternoon Macy Prout came to the office was one of the more significant afternoons of Bridget's time in Caldwell Creek, for several reasons. Macy was a small, composed woman of about 30, with an iron core visible beneath her politeness, the kind of woman the West produced by necessity. You either developed that core or the land, and the circumstance took you down. She sat across from Noah with her hands in her lap, and she told him everything, not just the letter but the weeks of sounds at night, the missing cattle, the way 2 of their hired hands had quit without explanation within the same week, the feeling of being slowly compressed into a corner. When Macy left with a copy of her statement and Noah's word that the letter would be kept secure in the evidence room, Bridget looked up from her transcription and found Noah watching her. "You're angry," he said. "Yes," she said. "Aren't you?" "Every single day," he said quietly. "The anger is what keeps me careful instead of reckless." It was one of the most honest things she had ever heard anyone say, and it landed in her chest with a weight that she recognized immediately as something she would carry for a long time. That night, she cooked dinner. It was her Thursday. She made a roast chicken with potatoes, which she was quietly proud of, and they ate together with a new quality to the silence between them, something that had shifted since the afternoon, like furniture that has been moved in a room and changes the entire feeling of the space without anything dramatic having happened. He poured them each a small glass of whiskey from a bottle he kept in the kitchen cabinet, which he had never done before on an ordinary evening, and she accepted it without comment, and they sat at the kitchen table while the evening came down around the small building and the town quieted, and he said, "Can I ask you something?" "Yes," she said. "Why did you come all the way out here? Not just west, specifically here, to a place like this with a job like this?" There it was. The held breath finally exhaled. She turned her whiskey glass slowly in her fingers and decided for the first time to tell someone the truth. Not all of it, but the real shape of it. "There was a man in Philadelphia," she said, "my supervisor. He made it clear that if I didn't accommodate certain things he wanted, he would make my professional life in that city impossible. When I refused and resigned, he made it impossible anyway. He filed a false accusation with the police, theft of documents." She looked up at him. "I did take documents, but they were evidence of his behavior toward women in that office, and I gave them to journalists, not for personal gain, but because it was the right thing to do. The accusation is false. But it follows me." She watched his face, waiting for the reaction, the withdrawal of trust, the professional recalculation, the moment when a lawman who was also her employer absorbed the fact that she was carrying a charge, however false. What she saw instead was something very different. His jaw tightened and his eyes went dark, and he said, in a voice that was very quiet and very deliberate, "He filed a theft charge against you for whistleblowing." "Yes." "And the journalists you gave the documents to, have they published anything?" "I received a letter 3 weeks ago," she said. "The story was going to print." He was quiet for a moment. Publication creates a public record. It establishes context for what you took and why. That makes the theft charge significantly harder to sustain, and it opens Purcell himself to civil liability. He paused. "Did you keep copies of everything?" "In my trunk," she said. "Copies of the documents I sent, my resignation letter, a diary of every incident with dates and times." "Good," he said. He met her eyes. "You were right to take them. You were right to give them to journalists. And I will tell you plainly that if anyone from Philadelphia comes to this county looking for you on the strength of that accusation, they will not find a cooperative jurisdiction." Something shifted in her throat. She had been carrying this for months and had not realized until this moment how heavy it was. She said, "You could get in trouble for that. Obstructing. An unjust process is not a process I'm obligated to enforce," he said flatly. "That's not obstruction, it's discretion, and discretion is the half of this job they don't write down in any manual." He paused, and then he said something she had not expected. "Also, you're the best administrative assistant this office has ever had, which is a practical consideration." She laughed. It was the first time she had laughed freely in this room, perhaps in longer than she realized, and it surprised them both, and his face did something she had not seen it do before. A real smile, not the fractional degree shift she had been cataloging, but an actual full expression of warmth. And it changed him completely, that smile. It made him into someone she had only glimpsed the outline of until now. "There it is," she said before she could stop herself. He looked at her. "You smile," she said, somewhat unnecessarily. "Occasionally," he said. "I wasn't sure," she admitted. "I wasn't sure either," he said, and then looked immediately into his whiskey glass as if this had been more than he intended to say. And she looked at her own glass and felt something bloom in her chest that she was nowhere near ready to name. October came to the Arizona Territory like a conversation that has been building towards something important, the air sharpening at night while the days stayed amber and wide. The cottonwood trees along the creek turned gold, and the mornings had a clarity to them that felt like being startled awake in the best possible way. The Alderton case was building. A second rancher, a man named Walt Giddens, came to the office with documentation of an incident in which a fence line had been cut and his cattle driven onto the road, 3 animals lost to injury. A third, a woman named Rosa Delgado, who ran a small but established ranching operation she had inherited from her father, brought in a ledger showing discrepancies she had been tracking for 6 months. Systematic small-scale theft of cattle that, when mapped against the Alderton operations records, showed a pattern that could not be dismissed as coincidence. Bridget organized all of it, cross-referenced it, mapped the pattern in clean, analytical language that transformed a collection of individual complaints into a coherent narrative of coordinated predation. She had done this kind of work in the newsroom, taking disparate pieces of information and finding the architecture underneath, and she was very good at it. Noah watched her work with an expression she had come to recognize as his version of impressed. That slight, permanent readjustment in the set of his face when he encountered something that exceeded his expectations. "You built a case," he said one evening, looking at the document she had prepared for the territorial prosecutor. It was 16 pages of carefully organized evidence, cross-referenced and annotated. "I organized the evidence you gathered," she said. "That's not the same thing." "Miss Farrow," he said, and something in the way he said it, the deliberate formality after weeks of first names at the kitchen table, made her look up. "I have been trying to build this case for 8 months, and I had a pile of reports that I could not make into a coherent argument. You came here 6 weeks ago and you made it into one. Do not undersell what you did." She held his gaze. The space between them was approximately 4 feet and felt considerably smaller. "Noah," she said, and his name in her mouth did something to the air between them. "Bridget," he said, equally careful. They stayed at that distance for a moment that expanded somehow into several moments, and then she looked back at the document and he cleared his throat and said, "I'm sending this to Tucson next week. I'll need to appear before the prosecutor to provide testimony." "Will that be safe?" she asked. "For me," he said. I'm more concerned about the office while I'm away. Holt will be watching. She straightened her spine. I have managed worse than Crane Holt, she said. I know, he said. And then, after a pause, I'll leave you a loaded shotgun. The prosecutor's office in Tucson responded within 2 weeks of receiving the case document. Noah was called to appear on a Tuesday, which meant he would be gone for 3 days, 2 nights. He prepared the office with a thoroughness that amounted to a very practical kind of worry, extra locks, a clear protocol for who to contact in case of trouble, the loaded shotgun on the shelf behind her desk that she told him she knew how to use, which was true because her father had been of the opinion that his daughter should be capable of defending herself, and had taught her on a farm outside the city when she was 16. The night before he left, he made dinner. It was a Friday, so it was his turn anyway, but he made more than his usual portions. A full pot roast with carrots and onions, a loaf of bread, an apple pie from dried apples that she would not have thought he possessed the patience to make. She came into the kitchen and stopped at the sight of it. That's a great deal of food, she observed. It will last you while I'm gone, he said, not turning from the stove. His voice had a careful quality to it that she was starting to recognize as him being uncertain, which was rare and therefore notable. She sat at the table. You didn't have to do that. I know, he said. He served the meal and they ate in the particular silence that is not uncomfortable but full, the kind of silence that has weight and meaning in it. And she thought about the first night when she had walked through that door and found 2 plates and a warm meal, the simplest possible evidence of a man who had, without knowing her at all, decided to treat her like someone worth feeding, someone worth the preparation of a meal. Can I ask you something now? She said. He looked up. The night I arrived, you had dinner ready. You didn't know when the stage would come in, whether I'd arrive in time to eat, whether I'd want to eat with you at all. Why did you have it ready? He set his fork down and seemed to consider the question with his full attention, the way she had noticed he considered things he took seriously. I knew the schedule of the Tucson stage, he said. You had telegraphed your confirmation of travel plans. I knew roughly when you would arrive. He paused. And you had come a very long way for a job that I had described in the least welcoming possible terms because I am not. He stopped. Tried again. I am not comfortable with certain kinds of communication. I am aware that my correspondence was not warm. I thought the least I could do was have something ready. She looked at him for a long moment. You felt guilty, she said. Something like surprise crossed his face. I suppose I did. That's very human of you, she said quietly. That fractional shift again, the degree of change, but this time it went further than usual. He looked at her like a man looking at something he wants very much and is very uncertain of his right to want, and she felt the same thing in herself, and the whole kitchen felt like a place on the edge of something. He left for Tucson the next morning. She missed him in a way that seemed disproportionate for someone she had known less than 2 months, and she was honest enough with herself to name what that was. The office felt different without his footsteps overhead. The coffee tasted different without the 20 minutes at the kitchen table. She did her work. She managed the correspondence. She sat at her desk in the evenings and read by lamplight, and she thought about a man who felt guilty about 4-line letters and made pot roast to compensate. On the second night, she heard something outside. A sound that was not the town's usual nighttime vocabulary, not a door, not a distant shout from the saloon, but something specific and deliberate. A footstep on the wooden walkway that ran along the back of the building. She was in her room upstairs. She moved to the window and looked down carefully, staying back from the glass, and saw nothing except shadow. But she stayed awake for another hour, and at some point she heard the sound again, and this time she recognized it as the sound of someone testing the lock on the evidence room door. She did not panic. She thought very clearly, the way she had been trained to think under pressure, and she determined that the evidence room lock was solid iron, recently replaced, and that if someone forced it, the sound would be significant enough to wake the entire ground floor. She also determined that Crane Holt was almost certainly the person doing the testing, and that Holt was ruthless but not stupid, and that he would not risk an illegal entry with witnesses potentially awake in the building. She went and found the shotgun and sat in the kitchen with it across her knees for the rest of the night. Nothing further happened. At 5 in the morning, she made coffee and waited for the light to come up, and when it did, she wrote down exactly what she had heard: the time, the duration, the location relative to the building, and she put the document in the evidence file under H for Holt. Noah came back from Tucson on a Thursday afternoon with the news that the territorial prosecutor had reviewed the case documentation and had issued an official summons for both Walter Alderton and Crane Holt to appear before the district court in December. The case was formally opened. The evidence Bridget had organized had done precisely what it needed to do. He told her this at the kitchen table over coffee, and she listened to the whole account, and when he finished she said, "There's something I need to add to the evidence file," and told him about the night of the attempted entry. His face went very still in a way she recognized now as the expression that meant he was controlling something significant. "You stayed downstairs all night with the shotgun." It seemed the appropriate response, she said. "You should have." He stopped himself. "There was no one to telegraph," he said. "Dr. Hooper is on the far end of town. You were alone." "I handled it," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. "Yes," he said, "you did." And then he said Bridget and stopped as if the name itself was a sentence. "What?" she asked, very quietly. He was quiet for a moment that stretched. "I thought about you the whole time I was gone," he said. "Not about the office, about you specifically. About whether you were all right and whether you were sleeping and whether—" He stopped again. The kitchen was very still. "I thought about you too," she said. It was not a declaration. It was not dramatic. It was just two people being honest in a small kitchen in a small town in the Arizona Territory in the fall of 1882. And it was enough. And it was more than enough. And it was the best possible version of what beginning can look like. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. His hand was warm and large and careful, the way everything he did was careful when it mattered. And she turned her hand over and held it. And they sat there like that while the coffee cooled, and the afternoon light moved across the kitchen floor. And neither of them felt any urgency to fill the silence with anything more than what was already there. The formal arrest of Crane Holt came on a cold morning in November, 2 weeks after Noah returned from Tucson. That last one meant Holt was no longer simply a suspect in an ongoing case. He was a subject of direct criminal charges, and Noah had the authority to arrest him on those charges without waiting for the December court date. He went to do it with a deputy, a young man named Perry Yates, who was earnest and moderately capable. And Bridget stayed in the office and did her work, and felt a specific kind of tight, patient fear that she managed by keeping her hands busy and her mind on the documents in front of her. Holt came in handcuffs 2 hours later. He was not quiet about it. He made the kind of noise that men make when they have always used their physical presence as a form of authority and are encountering the experience of that authority being removed. He said several things to Noah that she did not particularly want to transcribe. He looked at her once across the office with an expression that was meant to communicate consequence, and she met his eyes and did not look away, and he was put in a cell, and the cell door was locked. She wrote up the arrest report with perfect accuracy, including the threats he had made and the time and circumstances of each. and she put it in the evidence file. And she went to the kitchen and made a pot of coffee strong enough to walk on and brought 2 cups to the front office where Noah was standing at his desk, looking at nothing in particular. She set his cup in front of him and he picked it up without looking and drank from it and said, "Thank you." "You're welcome," she said. She sat in her chair. "He'll post bail, he'll try. I've asked the court to set it high enough to hold. And Alderton will get a lawyer. Probably 3 lawyers, and they will be excellent lawyers. This case needs to be airtight." He looked at her. "Which is why your documentation is what it is." "It is what it is," she said. He smiled at her. Not the fractional shift, not the guarded adjustment of expression. A real, full smile, the one she had first seen in the kitchen over whiskey, the one that changed his whole face. "What are you doing on Sunday?" he asked. She blinked. "Sunday is fend for yourself or the hotel dining room." "I know the schedule," he said. "I made the schedule. What I am asking is whether you would like to take a ride on Sunday, out toward the eastern creek. The cottonwood trees are something to see this time of year." She looked at him with a warmth that she was no longer trying to manage. "I would like that very much," she said. Sunday was extraordinary. The horses, a reliable gray called Edison, and a bay mare named Patience that she had been slowly learning to ride, moved through a landscape that the autumn had turned into something like a painting, all gold and rust, and the particular deep blue of the Arizona sky that looked, she had decided, like the sky had been made with deliberately excessive ambition. The creek wound through cottonwood groves that were releasing their leaves in long, slow spirals, and the water made a sound that was entirely at odds with everything wild and sparse about this landscape, gentle and intimate and unhurried. They rode mostly in silence, which was not the silence of people who have nothing to say, but the silence of people who are comfortable enough with each other not to fill every moment with words. At a certain point, Noah stopped his horse and she stopped hers beside him, and they sat looking at the water moving through the trees. "My father brought me out to a place like this once," he said quietly. "We lived in Missouri when I was young. There was a creek near our farm." He said the thing about water in dry country is that it teaches you what everything is actually for. In Missouri, water is everywhere and you stop seeing it. Out here, it's the reason for everything and you never stop seeing it. She listened. "And is that why you're so determined to protect this one?" "Partly," he said. "And partly because what Alderton is doing is simply wrong and someone needs to be the person who says so and means it." He paused. "I failed to be that person once before, in Tombstone. There was a situation, a man who was doing something wrong, and I had the evidence and I made a choice I thought was pragmatic and told myself was justified, and it wasn't. 3 people were hurt who didn't have to be. I have not been that kind of pragmatic since." She looked at him, at the clean line of his profile against the blue sky and the gold trees. "You've been carrying that for 4 years," she said. "It's useful weight," he said. "It keeps me honest." She understood this. She thought about her own useful weight, the things she carried that kept her oriented, that gave her moral north. She thought about Gerald Purcell and the documents and the journalists, and about this man beside her who had simply said, without drama or equivocation, that he would not enforce an unjust process. And the 2 thoughts came together in her mind and resolved into something clear and certain. She said, "I need to tell you something." He turned to look at her. "That letter I mentioned, the one from the journalist, I've been watching for a response from the Philadelphia papers, something indicating whether the story ran and what effect it had. I haven't received one. I've been carrying the possibility that nothing happened, that Purcell kept his connections and the story was killed, and that someone from Philadelphia could still arrive in this county looking for me on the strength of that charge." His gaze was steady, unhurried. "I told you how I'd handle that." "I know," she said, "but I wanted you to have the whole picture, not the edited version, the whole one." He looked at her for a long moment, and something in his expression was so directly and earnestly warm that it made her breath unsteady. "You're telling me you trust me," he said quietly. "Yes," she said, "I'm telling you I trust you." He reached over the small distance between their horses and took her hand, the same way he had taken it across the kitchen table, careful and warm. And he held it for a long moment while the creek made its gentle sound below them, and the cottonwood leaves came down around them in the November light like something out of a story she had not known she was living inside. "Bridget," he said. "Noah," she said. "I would like very much to court you properly," he said, "if that is something you would welcome." She looked at him and felt something enormous and gentle settle inside her, the resolution of every held breath since she had walked through that door and found 2 plates and a warm meal. "That is something I would very much welcome," she said. He brought her hand briefly to his lips, and the touch was gentle and deliberate and everything. And then he let it go, and they turned the horses back toward the trail, and they rode back to Caldwell Creek in a silence that was full of the very best kind of everything. The December court proceedings in Tucson were 3 days of testimony that Bridget did not witness directly but experienced through the detailed accounts Noah brought back each evening of the 2 weeks preceding the court date. The careful arguments, the growing weight of documentation, the moment when Rosa Delgado's ledger was entered into evidence, and the prosecutor's expression had shifted in a way that Noah described as a man who knows he has what he needs. Alderton's lawyers were, as predicted, excellent. They argued procedural challenges. They questioned the chain of evidence. They attempted to reframe the stolen cattle and the threatening letters as misunderstandings and coincidences. What they could not argue around was 16 pages of cross-referenced, precisely documented evidence prepared by a woman who had spent 4 years in a newsroom learning to make information tell the truth. Walter Alderton was found liable for civil conspiracy and ordered to divest from the 4 properties he had acquired through intimidation, the properties to be returned to their original owners at fair market value. Crane Holt was convicted on charges of criminal intimidation, property destruction, and conspiracy, and sentenced to 5 years. "It's done," she said. "It's done," he said. "The Pruitts keep their land. The Giddens keep their land. Rosa keeps hers. The creek belongs to the county, legally protected water access for all the eastern ranches. Your father would have been glad of that," she said quietly. He smiled, and it was the full smile, the one she had catalogued and treasured, and it was directed entirely at her. "I think," he said, "that I want to say something to you." "Then say it," she said. "I have been, for 4 years, not particularly happy," he said, with the directness of someone who has decided that his usual economical approach to language is precisely what this moment needs. "I have been busy and purposeful, and I have done my work to the best of my ability, and I have believed that was sufficient." He paused. "I am telling you that I love you. I am telling you that in the way I tell you things, which is directly and honestly and without a great deal of decorative language, because you deserve to know it, and because I think you feel the same, but I didn't want to assume." She looked at him across the kitchen table in the small warm room in the small town in the enormous territory, and she thought about every wall she had built, and the particular violence with which this man had never once pushed against any of them, and how they had simply, one by one, ceased to be necessary. "You don't need to assume," she said. "I love you. I have loved you since somewhere between the first pot of coffee and the creek on Sunday, and I have been trying not to, because I was afraid that love was something I couldn't afford to be certain about in this place at this time. She looked at her wine glass and then back at him. I'm done being afraid of that. He was on his feet before she quite registered that he had moved, and she was on hers, and the 4 feet of kitchen table was simply not between them anymore, and he held her face in both of his hands, careful and deliberate the way all his touches were, and kissed her with the same quality his silences had, full and certain, and saying everything. The winter settled on Caldwell Creek with a gentle efficiency. The news came from Philadelphia in January, forwarded through Margaret in a long, triumphant letter that Bridget read at the kitchen table with her heart pounding, and Noah sitting across from her watching her face, that not one but 2 of the 3 journalists she had contacted had published their stories in December, and that Gerald Purcell had been dismissed from the Register and was facing a formal inquiry. The theft charge against Bridget Farrow of Philadelphia had been dropped quietly by the municipal police, who had evidently decided that the optics of pursuing it were considerably worse than the optics of letting it expire. She set the letter down on the table and looked at her hands for a moment. Noah said, "Well, it's over," she said. "In Philadelphia, it's over." He reached across and covered her hands with both of his, and she looked up at him, and the expression on his face was so completely and quietly glad that she felt it behind her eyes. "You can go back," he said. "If you want to." She looked at him. "Is that what you want?" He held her gaze steadily. "What I want," he said, "is for you to make the choice that is right for you. And if that choice takes you back east, then I will learn to be a man who writes better letters, and I will write them every single day." She thought about Philadelphia. She thought about the newsroom and Margaret's breakfast table and the row of houses where she had grown up, and the life she had been living before Gerald Purcell had tried to take it from her. She thought about what she had come here for: escape, survival, a temporary post, and what she had found instead. She thought about a warm meal waiting for a stranger. "Noah," she said, "I would like to stay in Caldwell Creek." The smile that crossed his face was the most complete thing she had ever seen. He proposed to her formally in February, on a Sunday, at the creek, with the cottonwood trees bare and silvery in the winter light, and the water running clear and cold over its smooth stones. He did it with a ring he had ordered from a jeweler in Tucson, a simple gold band with a small garnet, which was her birthstone, which meant he had asked Margaret in a letter, which she discovered later and which undid her completely. He got down on one knee in the winter grass beside the creek, and he asked her in his direct and honest way, without decorative language, whether she would do him the honor of marrying him, and she said yes, before he had quite finished the question. They were married in April in the church on Main Street, on a day that was all blue sky and warm wind, the kind of spring day the Arizona Territory produced as if to demonstrate what it was capable of when it was in a generous mood. The ceremony was small but not quiet. Dr. Hooper was there, and Clara Marsh from the hotel, and Thomas Yee from the general store, and the Proots, Macy taking Bridget's hands before the ceremony and saying something quietly that made Bridget's eyes fill, and Rosa Delgado, who brought tamales that were consumed before the formal celebration dinner at the hotel even began. They danced that evening on the wooden floor of the hotel dining room, the furniture pushed back and the lamps turned up, and someone producing a fiddle and someone else producing a guitar. And they danced with the unself-conscious joy of 2 people who have been careful and controlled for a very long time and have decided in this moment to simply be happy, and it was wonderful. She wrote to Margaret that night, still in her wedding dress, sitting at the kitchen table, their kitchen table now, unambiguously theirs with a single candle burning. She wrote about Noah and the ring and the garnet and the creek, And she wrote about the cottonwood trees and the casework and the warm meal on the first night, and about how love is the strangest thing, how it appears in the most unexpected forms, how it had appeared for her in the form of a man who wrote terrible letters and cooked extraordinary stew and held her hands like they were something worth holding. Margaret wrote back 3 weeks later with news that she was engaged herself, to a man she described as quite amusing and frankly bewildering, and that she planned to visit Caldwell Creek in the autumn, and that the Philadelphia stories were still circulating, and Gerald Purcell was having, apparently, a very bad year, and that she had shown several of Bridget's letters to a woman editor she knew who thought Bridget might consider writing for publication. Bridget folded this letter and put it on her side of the desk. They had moved a second desk into the office, so she had her own, which had been Noah's idea, delivered in his usual manner. "We should get a second desk. Your organizational work is half of what this office produces. You should have a proper space." And she looked at the organizational possibilities of that for the rest of the afternoon with a warmth she felt all the way down. The first year of their marriage went like a good year goes, with the particular texture of days that are built by two people who are both trying to build something real. The office ran better than it ever had. Noah's reports to the territorial government were cited twice by the governor's office as models of documentation. He was too tactful to tell Bridget that this was directly attributable to her, but she knew, and the knowing was pleasant. Caldwell Creek grew by another 60 residents. The railroad talk intensified and began to look like it might, this time, actually be true. In the late fall of their first year together, Bridget realized she was expecting a child, a discovery she made on a Tuesday morning in October with a certainty that settled on her with the same quality as all the important certainties in her life. Not dramatic, but absolutely clear. She told Noah that evening after dinner, at the kitchen table, with the particular directness she had learned from him. "I believe we are going to be a family of 3, she said. He looked at her for a moment of complete stillness, and then something crossed his face that she had never seen before, a kind of undone quality, the expression of a man encountering something that exceeds his preparation entirely, and it was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen on him. He got up from his chair and came around the table and crouched down beside her and took her hands in both of his, and he looked up at her with those storm-colored eyes that were entirely clear at this moment, entirely unguarded, and he said, "Are you all right? How are you feeling?" "Are you, Noah?" she said, laughing. "I'm fine, I'm wonderful." He pressed her hands briefly to his forehead in a gesture so uncharacteristically unguarded that it made her throat ache with tenderness, and then he straightened and looked at her with the full smile. Not the fractional shift, not the guarded adjustment, the full and complete one, and said, "I am very glad." "So am I," she said. Their son was born in June of 1884, a healthy and determined arrival who announced himself with considerable volume and continued, in Noah's dryly expressed opinion, to be among the louder developments in the history of the county. They named him Samuel, after the rancher whose land they had helped save, and Samuel Ellery grew up in a sheriff's office where the filing system was impeccable, and the kitchen always smelled of something good, and his father's voice was low and measured, and his mother's mind was the sharpest thing in any room she entered. 2 years later, a second child arrived, a daughter this time, which delighted everyone in the town because the news spread, as news does in small places, before Bridget and Noah had gotten around to officially mentioning it. They named her Jane, after nobody in particular, except that it was a name they both liked. A small, solid 4-letter name that suited the quiet and direct spirit she displayed from approximately her first week in the world. The railroad came to Caldwell Creek in 1886, and with it came commerce and strangers, and the particular disruption of a small place encountering acceleration. Noah navigated this with the same steadiness he had navigated everything, methodical, honest, prepared to make hard calls when they were required. He was re-elected as sheriff 3 times by margins that reflected not popularity in the superficial sense, but the specific trust of a community that had watched him choose justice over convenience consistently and over a long period of time. Bridget wrote. She had started writing for the woman editor Margaret had mentioned small pieces at first, administrative and organizational matters, but expanding over time into longer investigative essays about governance in the territorial West, about water rights, about the systematic displacement of smaller landholders by consolidated interests. These pieces ran in Eastern papers under her name, Bridget Ellery, and were read more widely than she initially expected, and eventually resulted in a sustained correspondence with several prominent reformers that occupied the third desk she eventually requested for the office. Noah's only comment on the third desk was, "The office is going to need to be expanded." "Probably," she said. "I'll speak to the town council on Thursday," he said, and went back to his report. She loved him more for each of these small, practical acts of support than for anything dramatic, which was exactly right and exactly how she would have designed it. Samuel was 6 and Jane was nearly 4 on the afternoon that Bridget was at her desk working through correspondence when she heard the front door open, and looked up to find a woman of about her own age standing in the doorway with 2 pieces of luggage, and a face arranged in the expression of someone who has prepared themselves for something difficult. "I was told this was the sheriff's office," the woman said. "I was told the sheriff's wife might be able to help me." Bridget set down her pen. "Come in," she said. "Tell me what you need." The woman, whose name turned out to be Harriet Chase, was a schoolteacher from New Mexico who had been offered a position in Caldwell Creek's new school, the school that had been established 2 years prior, funded partly by Bridget's own persuasion of the town council, and who had arrived on the stage to find that the housing she had been promised was not, in fact, available because of a misunderstanding with the property owner. Noah solved the housing problem within the hour through a straightforward conversation with Clara Marsh at the hotel, who had a room available and a long-standing fondness for Bridget that extended readily to people Bridget was advocating for. Harriet Chase was settled, fed, and assured of a proper housing arrangement by dinner. Before she left, she looked at Bridget with an expression of genuine surprise. "I was told this was a rough little town on the edge of nowhere," she said. "It is," Bridget said, "but the people in it are good." "You didn't have to help me," Harriet said. Bridget thought about a warm meal waiting for a stranger. She thought about 2 plates instead of 1, and a ring with a garnet birthstone, and a man who had asked Margaret what her favorite stone was in a letter he had clearly been nervous about writing because the handwriting was slightly less even than usual. She thought about all of it and felt the accumulated weight of a life that had been built carefully and honestly and with full love in a place she had not looked for and would not trade for anything. "Somebody helped me when I didn't expect it," she said simply. "That's how it tends to work." "Good day," he said. "Very good," she said. "A new teacher arrived, Harriet Chase. She'll be excellent." "You've spoken to her for an hour," he said. "I know," she said. "I can tell." He was quiet for a moment. "Samuel asked me today if he could learn to ride on his own without the lead rope." "What did you say?" "I said he could try on Saturday with me watching." She smiled at the distance. "He'll do fine." "He will," Noah said. He paused. "He has your determination." "He has your stubbornness," she said. "Those are the same quality," he said. She laughed, and he squeezed her shoulder gently, and they stood in the doorway of the office they had built together. The office with 3 desks and an excellent filing system, and a kitchen that always smelled of something good, in the town that had grown around them and through them, and because of them in ways that were both visible and invisible. And the evening came down warm and wide and full of everything they had made.